I have help even when I don't know it. So without disputing too much the Ron Don statement, I wanted to say, well, you could have said crone, which maybe wasn't, as desirable, but certainly hot chick is long gone. So I'm honored once again to be working with Ed Gordon, and at this time of transition, as many of you know, I think at SC you've had your graduation and maybe at Stanford as well. Sunday. And at UCLA this is graduation time for us, and at the lab school it is culmination time tomorrow for my granddaughter, and I think it is called here partly because it's a graduation for one of his grandchildren as well. So this is transition week, right? And in some ways there's a lot of joy and sorrow, and that applies to being a commission member, because this is essentially our final public gathering as far as I know, and it's been a really interesting and complicated experience that has enlightened me, not as much so that they translate it into slides, but I have to think about things a little longer. So I'm going to try to be relatively quick and encourage my colleagues also to move right along, and then give you, so that at the end of our whole discussion, this first session, we'll have a chance for questions. So please, if you don't mind holding your questions until we end the I know, I do this every time, the changing locusts of assessment. So a long time ago in faraway land, teachers taught and developed their own assessments. Anybody in the room remember that? As teachers, as kids, yeah, right now, most of you are too young. It happened. But these assessments were truly wobbly on technical grounds, but very strong on their instructional relevance. Actually, teachers were trying to measure what they were actually doing with kids. So in my view, tests that emerged over a 20/30-year period that were developed for different levels of accountability: program accountability, school accountability, ultimately kid accountability. I think that those tests have inverted that relationship. That is, they are strong on technical grounds and sometimes weak, or weaker than we would like, on instructional relevance. The Gordon report I could have a lot to say about. You can't see my picture, but it's flowers. It is very much like Ed in some ways. First of all, it's very readable and very coherent. Secondly, it has a kind of elegance to it, which Ed exhibits and has exhibited throughout his life. And it maintains kind of a hopeful orientation. It isn't like, oh, it's all over one more time. It still has a place for the education system and all of us in it to go. But I think there are some key questions that Ed alluded to, and these aren't necessarily the ones that he was thinking of, but that are underneath the surface of the summaries, at least, of the report. And one is a question about, can this system that we have that involves learning and assessment be rebalanced in the right way? That is, starting with aspirations for assessment in the service of learning, or assessment for learning, as discussed here. And I list a number of dates where there were very famous people and movements and activities all around that issue. And each time those issues were submerged, like accountability requirements and sort of lost credibility into the outside world. So the question is, can we transform this into a coherent policy that balances our interest in improving learning and doing things that help kids and teachers to unlock all of those things that need opening up, and will we be flexible, and what's the balance again between flexibility and uniformity and all of that, and will the technical supports in place or to be invented by at least two of these people at the end of this table, will they be able to support some of these bigger challenges, because it does require a very different way of thinking about what you mean by validity and technical quality. So I'm just, my part in this work was to write about, which is odd because I probably have a little, not a long future, but I decided I was writing about the future as far as anyone could think and not just limited by my, corporal being. So I was interested in sort of predicted contexts, what might be assessed, who might be assessed, and what are the concerns. So I'll run through these. And just very briefly, we do have an issue that was recognized by the Commission about sort of the balancing of accountability and equity. How are we going to do that in such a way? Let's even talk about the consortia for a moment. If the consortia get implemented all at once at all grade levels, which isn't necessarily the case, but could be the case, then there's a question about what do you expect of a ninth grade student if they haven't been taught all the things that are expected below that and the standards have been raised. And that question, of course, is exacerbated for children who have been underperforming and have had some difficulties in school. And so the question, I guess, is how we could move toward the vision of the Gordon Commission in integrating curriculum, learning, and assessment. And that suggested to me that instead of individual test scores, we might be looking at the evaluation, very stringent evaluation of curriculum and what the curricula does, and not necessarily continue to have to give individual test scores if people are going through curricula and being successful. When I was looking at the future, I will not talk about all these things, but there are very important issues that are on everyone's mind. Number one, it's not only the explosion of knowledge, but it's the correction and revision of knowledge that we already have. And that's a major issue happening. Cycle time is faster and faster on that. Secondly, there are questions about context, and I'll expand on that a little bit, but I'm really talking about the context of the learners, who they think they are, how they think they operate in the world, and why that seems to be quite different from anything that went on, for the last 40 years. A third important point is, as indicated by Marcelo, the migration, immigration, and birth rates and how those interact. And what, if you want to do something interesting, go look up the birth rates in Italy, in Taiwan, in Japan. And Japan has a clock that says the last Japanese child will be born on this date at this time, unless something changes. So this seems to be the case for many, if not all, developed countries. The U.S. would be in that place. And will be in that place unless it develops some sort of enlightened immigration policy. The multinational sources of careers and jobs, I don't need to say much more about that, but it makes it very clear that our students, whether you like the term competition or not, they will be competing at some level with kids from other places in other countries with other skill sets. And we have to take that into account. And while there's a globalization, localization balance also, There's still no way of avoiding the fact that it is a global economy that we are in right now, and the competition will increase. So then what are the things that people have to learn plus domains? And there have been lots of different formulations of this, some in the military, some of us in psychology-ish fields have been talking about topics like problem solving and communication for many, many years. But the notion is that if contexts are changing rapidly, jobs are being reinvented or invented, domain content varies a lot, then what can you teach people that will be useful and not obsolete immediately? And the notion that you've read about both in publications of the National Research Council and lots of books that many of us have written or contributed to involve the 21st century skill set and include things that are on the slide, reasoning, problem solving, decision making, risk assessment, things like that, but always in the context of the domain content that you're learning, not teaching them sort of in the cloud. We wanted to touch ground, ideally, people to learn communication skills in math, in science, in other areas than just literacy. We have a whole area of affective and whole learner motivation, concerns about self-efficacy. Certainly we all need to be better and clearer about our feelings and how we, our resiliency, if we're working in teams, how does empathy work in a productive way, and what's the emotional component that we ought to be addressing in schools, as I know happens at the university lab school at UCLA and in other university-supported schools, but that isn't always the case. Social emotional issues are often not dealt with in school settings. And then for me, of course, I sort of the old drum, I said we have to have measures of application or transfer that take what people have been taught, take what people have been measured on in whatever context, and move them to new contexts, new representations, new challenges, to get them ready for dealing with an unpredictable future. And that's, I think, our major task. Learners are changing. I won't belabor this, but we know there aren't so many intervening institutions that act as gatekeepers for kids anymore. Kids are looking at things like I roll my eyes. I still have to be blocked from every grandchild's Facebook page. But I do see things that I would like to talk to their mother about and refrain from doing so. At any rate, they are interested in this point-to-point, person-to-person communication. We see it on their texting behavior. And there's no difference for them in public and private anymore. We have a pretty clear notion of what privacy is, and Lewis have had discussions about privacy. It said to me, give it up, Eva. It's over. And so that may be true, but it hurts. How will assessment take place? Okay, just all of these augmented reality, gesture stuff, neuro stuff, all the things we know about, but that's almost the so what. In that it does provide affordances to get deeper and more interesting and longer-term activity, but that's not the main thing. I think a very interesting point suggested to me by my husband this morning, reading the New York Times, was that the data richness of our environment is getting kind of crazy. And in the New York Times, they noted, if you believe the newspaper, that 90% of the world's data developed in the last 2 years, and that they expect that number to double every 2 years. So even if in education we're a little slower, that's still a lot. And that isn't the kind of data that will allow us to be having teachers look at three kinds of components that a kid did and then say, oh yes, you can go here, you can go there. It's a much deeper and complex set of information that may bubble up to a level that teachers can use. But as we envision it, and I am including me in this, or the kids remember it as he wishes, and the rest of our team, we're looking at a gap, some kind of assessment at that, and systems that adapt to learning, engagement, background, that provide choice, that's on the fly, that you can make it up as you go along. The systems can make it up as they go along, so they can be most personalized, and that they come to all these multiple input channels. So front end is defined as requirement, specifications, and the outcomes. Here's a picture. Marcus, where are you? Are you here? This is his problem. Marcus did the ontology of Common Core for us, and if you really want to know how things actually connect, he suffered with that. With his team for quite a while. This sort of flows it off So this also involves some changes in our regular research and validation processes. We may be in iterative trials, we may be doing kind of experiments, we may be crowdsourcing design components of our assessments, crowdsourcing evaluations, and not doing pilot and field tests in the way that we have come to it. And the result would be many other paths, uncountable number of paths for kids to go through to optimize, or at least to get them to the best place that we're able to do. Now, one line on the Gordon recommendations. Do we need innovation and research, which is one major recommendation, and I think all of us in the room would say that. Do we need a kind of group to do regulation and oversight? That was, I guess, maybe for me. And if we like the way it's designed, I suppose, and should be centralized in one group, I'm not so sure. I mean, maybe there's ways of having these kinds of oversight that in a distributed or very democratic way. So that's my set of comments. I want to thank you, and I believe you're laughing.